Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I was so sorry to not be here for last week's service, which was glorious and so meaningful. And indeed, we are likely the only synagogue in the universe which acknowledges that moment in our Jewish history of the execution of the major poets and writers and other intellectuals in Jewish life in the former Soviet Union. I was at Glimmerglass, where Randy and I go every summer for a long weekend of a deep dive into music. Saw some other CBST congregants who were there, which was lovely. And there is nothing like being able to explore something with immersive, complete diving in. Do you know what I mean? Like there's something so special about that. And it was an incredibly beautiful weekend. And this week we're in Parshat Shoftim. As I mentioned, it is literally means judges, the parsha of judges, judging. A lot of important and very famous sayings. As I mentioned, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof is the most famous from this parsha, but there's even a lot more. There are times in our Jewish tradition that the surface meaning of the Jewish texts are very arcane, obscure, offensive, difficult to understand, insulting, and downright alienating. And one of those areas, of course, is around LGBT issues, right? They're looking at the texts on the surface as they relate to our tradition, and gay men who are only mentioned in the Bible. Lesbians were not mentioned in the Bible, which is, I always used to say when I used to do my speaking, I spoke a lot publicly to non-gay audiences about LGBT issues when I first came to CBST, and I said to them, well, don't you think if God really cared about this, the women would have been included also? How seriously can we be taking this if it's only about the men? And well, it's always only about the men. Okay, so that means that maybe God is okay about women who are in a same-sex relationship. Anyway, I always thought that was funny, but they didn't really think it was so funny. And indeed, in Jewish tradition, gay men get the sentence for engaging in gay male sex is much more serious than for women, because the prohibition for men is found in the Bible, and the rabbis only a few hundred or maybe even significant time later got around to prohibiting women, so it has the sentence for women is much lighter. So some of you should get some comfort in that. But so there are texts that are very difficult to understand. And for those of you who studied with me the book of Psalms for 18 months, might have, I hope, experienced in the process of that kind of immersive, deep dive experience, a transformation in the way you look at a text that on the surface is initially arcane and inaccessible. It's amazing what happens after you spend some time and effort and study. You get to a really different relationship with those same texts that on the surface or on a immediate level are very hard to get. This is why I react strongly when people come into an experience and say, on the surface, is it meaningful? When, guess what? A lot of the most meaningful things in life take a lot of work to get there. And if you don't hang in, if you don't keep going, if you don't keep giving it a chance, it's sometimes pretty hard to get there. And text in our Jewish tradition is a great example of that. In fact, in Jewish tradition, there are two sets of laws. One set are called a chok, and another set of laws are mishpat, or chukim and mishpatim. You've heard that phrase. We say that in various places in literature. Chukim and mishpatim. And those are two different ways to talk about law. But what's the difference between them? And actually, in modern Hebrew, I have no idea what the difference is. Yael, would you say there's any difference in modern Hebrew? They're quite the same. And in fact, it's a phrase. Chukim umishpatim. It's a phrase. But in rabbinic Judaism and in halachic Judaism, and in Judaism that an Orthodox person would observe, there's a big difference between a chok and a mishpat. And what's the difference? A chok has no reason to it. There's no surface meaning to a chok. It's a law that we've received from the tradition, and we do it because we've received it, and there's an important way to have a relationship with God, because you're doing something that isn't meaningful on the human surface, but by doing it, God is telling us you'll get to meaning. Example of that would be something like kashrut. There's no meaning to it. Yes, I know people argue pigs aren't clean, or the bottom feeders in the ocean. I'm not going to ask how many people in this room love lobsters, so I'm going to stay away from that question. But that's an example of there's no real so what do I mean? So a mishpat, on the other hand, is like don't kill, don't steal. Like on the surface, you understand why that would be in a legal system. On the surface, you don't understand why don't mix milk and meat is in a legal system. So our tradition has in its very DNA this tension between things that are easily understandable, but still we sometimes push ourselves there, or things that are on the surface very clearly understandable, even in the most modern world. And that's why our texts are full of things that, oh my God, the gay stuff is crazy, but let me tell you, there's a lot of crazier stuff than that. I mean, don't mix wool and linen in your clothing. That's a great example of a chok. It's a rule that has what does it mean? Don't mix. Go ahead, you should check, and you should know that if you go into an Orthodox-owned store, if you're buying a piece of clothing, there will be a little label that'll say it's been shatnez checked. And it's as important to somebody who follows all of the traditions as do not kill. So we have this balance between the things that we as modern people tend to only want to do the stuff that makes sense to us. And that, I think, is a challenge our tradition gives us, that we have to be willing to hang in there sometimes for things that don't make as much sense. And I think we in this community are a great example of that. Had we given up on those 2 psukim in Vayikra, in Leviticus, the 2 verses, and there are only 2 verses that condemn homosexuality in the Bible, had we assumed that that was it, there would be none of us here. But for decades, many of us who have been working on transforming religious life around gay stuff hung in there and said, we will not abdicate our tradition because this is so upsetting. We're going to find a new way to understand it. We're going to understand it in completely different ways, perhaps, but that is itself a very Jewish traditional tack, right? We're going to try and re-understand it in a way that makes sense, but respects that our text is there for us to struggle with. And we have to respect that sometimes things won't make sense, but we remain in relationship with it. That's a profound reality of our tradition. But this week's Parsha is an example of a text that makes all the sense in the world. And in the modern world in which we find ourselves right now, and I'm not going to talk about indictments, I'm not going to talk about anything that's going on, but keep that in mind. So, in this week's Parsha, you barely have to translate it to understand what these words mean. It is over and over again. Speak truth to one another. Don't use honest weights. In other words, don't put your thumb on the scale, which is both literal and metaphorical. Don't treat the rich and poor differently. Be honest. Don't pervert the law. If you're a judge, don't take a bribe. Tell the truth. These are in the same text that says things that are so hard to understand, like don't mix wool and linen. Nobody could argue with these words, right? That's why when I hear these Bible-thumping religious people support certain things in this country, this text is there also, right there. There's no gloss here. I just translated the Hebrew. I did not make it easier to digest in any way except putting it into English. In Zechariah, which is quoted in Pirkei Avot in the very famous quote that says, On three things the world is established, Pirkei Avot says, ethics of our ancestors: on justice, on speaking the truth, and on shalom, and on peace. These three things are the pillars of what make the world possible. Zechariah, in that same section, says, Elah hadvarim asher ta'asu, these are the things that you must do. Dabru emet. Okay, I can bet even our beginning Hebrew people can understand that. Dabru, lidaber, speak in the imperative. Speak emet, speak truthfully. Ish et re'ehu, one to the other, among yourselves. Emet umishpat, shalom shiftu b'sharechem. You should peace, laws, justice, shalom shiftu. You should rule in or judge in your gates. In other words, in the places where your cities, the comings and goings of your cities. Dabru emet, speak truth. We have to remember, no matter what's going on in the world around us, that we have this powerful injunction that honesty, being truthful, is at the center of a meaningful life. Now, I have to say there are interesting exceptions to speaking the truth in the Jewish tradition. It is not, like anything, immutable. There are places and times that our tradition tells us that it's okay not to speak the whole truth and nothing but the truth. None of those, however, is a court of law or what a public official may do. But let me give you some examples of places where our tradition has outlined it's okay to tell a little fib. And it comes from Aaron in the Bible, Aharon, when he would try to make peace, and this is from a midrash, between quarreling spouses and friends. He would approach one party and tell them that the other party is really sorry and wants to reconcile. When the person would hear this, they would express an interest in resolving the dispute. Aaron would then go to the other person and say that party number one is interested in a resolution, at which point, the midrash tells us, everybody would make up. So therefore, according to this midrash, this is a very famous example of it's actually a mitzvah to lie in this way in order to maintain peace. So in order to create peace, because otherwise, if dabru emet meant you could never fudge things a little bit, it means you have to tell the first one the other one hates him, and tell the second one that she hates it. No, we are told that what we could do to soften relationships in order to create peace, it's okay to be able to fudge things enough to try and bring people together. Based on that midrash, that story about Aaron bringing together, and this is why Aaron is known as Rodef Shalom, the pursuer of peace in our tradition. He's known as the one who finagles, who manages, who's a little bit of a handler in order to try and create peace among people. So here are a few other examples of what we might call permitted, little lies. You'll notice also the areas, as I said, which are not permitted anywhere close to a courtroom. There's no place in a courtroom for a judge or in the exercise of justice. But however, here, changing the truth in order to practice humility is permitted. For example, one may claim ignorance of a certain Talmudic tractate, even if one does actually know it. If it will spare somebody else from feeling shame, it is okay to be able to do that. Changing the truth in order to protect someone else from harm or inconvenience. For example, this one I love. If a host was very gracious and one is asked about this, one should not tell everything about their magnanimity, as it may cause too many guests to flock to him. These are actually from the Talmud. I love these. On a similar vein, if a person has an incurable illness and informing them of this will be detrimental to their health, it may be, depending on the circumstances, proper to withhold all the details of the illness from them. It's okay to bend the truth a little bit to protect someone from embarrassment. And the famous example of this is that if somebody who is about to be married, a bride, is beautiful, you must say that a bride is beautiful and gracious, even if she isn't particularly beautiful or gracious. You're allowed to use exaggerated expressions, which is really good for somebody like me, if it's clear that's an exaggeration. For example, you're allowed to say, "You look white as a sheet." If you know it's an exaggeration, it's okay. And a few more. If someone does something for themselves, but another understands that it was done to honor them, the person speaking, one doesn't have to correct the misunderstanding. The Talmud's example of this is several rabbis were traveling from one city to another, and a rabbi who approached them thought that they had come to greet him. In such a case, the Talmud concludes, it is not necessary to correct the mistake. And then, of course, we being Jews, there are exceptions to the exceptions. The Talmud goes on to say, despite these allowances for not saying exactly the whole truth and nothing but the truth, one should always attempt not to say an outright lie, but to try and tell half-truths. Even in these cases, one should avoid lying to children so as not to train them to lie. And even in all of the circumstances in which it's permitted in the above list, one should try not to lie on a constant basis. So I just love that our tradition has the rules and then the exceptions and then the exceptions to the exceptions. It is, however, in this season of Elul, a moment of really examining our truth-telling. Most of the list of al-chaitz that we do when we say all of the list of Asham news, Bagad news, and all the al-chaitz on this thing in which I missed the mark, and on this thing I missed the mark, and on, most of them are about speech. Some are not, but most are about speech, about 70%. Dabru emet. To the extent possible, we have to keep building for the world we want, no matter what goes on around us. No matter what those in different political positions act and how they are, we must continue to build the world as we want it, in our own lives, with each other, in the universe in which we have any influence, which, guess what, starts right here. Dabru emet. Open yourself up to truth. Find a way to embrace the power of being truthful. Open your heart. Find a way in this season of Elul to soften the places that are really crudded over. Find ways to listen to truth that maybe you've been avoiding. Open yourself up. Join us. If you know these words, we'll offer them to you as we find a way to open ourselves up to truth. Open ourselves up to finding justice. Open ourselves up as we take this journey to the days of awe. Trust in yourselves. Trust.
Open my eyes to truth. Open my hands to give freely. Open my lips to good words, to pure words. Open my heart to love. Open my eyes to truth. Open my hands to give freely. Open my lips to good words, to pure words. my lips to good words,
Open
to
my lips to
pure
good words.
Open